Today's daf is daf Kuf Yud, and we'll count down around 10 lines from the top. The Kulam Shechosru. So this is where we're going to pick it up, and the discussion is about Chosru. And the question is whether you're chayev for Halah B'chutz if part of the carbon is missing. So Ibailu, the Gemara tries to analyze this. Chisaron de chutz shmei chisaron or lo shmei chisaron. So we're talking about a carbon that was taken out of the Migdash, out of the Azara. And as we said before, there was some sort of a chisaron in which they reduced part of the carbon. And now the question is if he would be makriv, that which is left, the remaining part of the carbon, outside of the Migdash on a Mizbeach, whether or not he'd be chayav. Now, this is according to the Chachamim. The Chachamim say that in general, when you mala a carbon outside of the Migdash, which is called halas chutz, if it's missing part of the carbon, then you're not chayav halas chutz. So the Gemara says, "Mi amrinan keva de nofak if salulahu." The part of the carbon that was missing inside the azara is already possible, and therefore mali chaser mali yeser. I don't care whether or not the carbon now outside is complete or incomplete. It should be irrelevant because you're only chayv halas chutz in something that could have been brought on the mizbeach b'fnim. And therefore, since when the carbon left the azara, it became possible, then even if it's yeser, even if it's full, it's remained in its original pact, it's already possible. And therefore, if it's possible, how can you be chayv halas chutz? O Dilma, here's the other tzad in the Gemara Safek. Yotze de isa bi ene ein. Then you could be chayiv for yotze. The fact that it left the azor, that doesn't bother me for halas chutz. You'd be chayiv anyway. Why? Because at least you have the entire carbon. But in this case, you're not even burning the entire carbon. The lesser be'ene lo. Lesser be'ene means how can you be chayiv if you don't have the entire carbon? Omar Abai Toshma. I'm going to prove it from our Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Lazar poter yakriv es kula. Rabbi Lazar says that when are you chai for halah? That's only if you makriv the entire carbon, and now you're missing part of the carbon. Then you're not chayiv. The only problem is the entire suffix of Ibailu that the Gemara raised is not a question on Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar, we know, would say that you're not chayiv. We were asking about the Chachamim. Amalei Rav Bar Rav Chanan Abaye, Mida Rabbi Lazar, Elazar Pashut Mar. Are you bringing a solution to our question from Rabbi Lazar? Rabbi Lazar clearly says that you're not chayav achi yakriv kulon, and if you're chaser, if it's missing part of the carbon, then for sure you're not chayav. Our entire suffix was only according to the Chachamim who reject Rabbi Lazar, and they're of the opinion that you can be chayav halas chutz even on part of the carbon. We'll have to see exactly what the minimum shear is. Let's say it's a kisayis. Amalei beferish miale minei derav. I heard the following thing from Rav directly. Ad kan lo pligi Rabbanan alei Rabbi Lazar. When do the Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Lazar? Elab de isa be'ene. In other words, you have the whole carbon in its entirety, it exists. And therefore, according to the Chachamim against Rabbi Lazar, you could be chayiv halos chutz even on part of the korban. Aval b'chisaron, says Rav, in a case where you don't even have the entire be'en and part of the korban is reduced, it's missing, he's potter. Lav de chaser b'chutz. Now it would seem that Rav might be talking about a case that although the korban was complete in its entirety while it was in the Azara, but when it went out of the Azara, that's where it was reduced. And yet Rav says that he's not chayiv halos chutz, even according to the Chachamim, because the Chachamim are moder, they concede to Rabbi Lazar in the case where it became chaser outside of the Mikdash, you're not chayiv halo b'chutz. And the Gemara rejects it. The Gemara says, "Lo, the chaser b'fnim." Rav was not talking about a case where it was chaser on the outside. He was talking about the case where in the Mikdash it was chaser. And Rav said that nevertheless, even though the Chachamim say that there's no condition in halas chutz that you only chayiv if you burn the whole korban, but nevertheless, says Rav, in the case where it became chaser, and now the Gemara is saying that Rav's statement was de chaser b'fnim, and therefore he's potter because the only time you chayv halos chutz, say the Rabbanan, is when you could have been makriv on the inside. If it became chaser already b'fnim, then already at that point you established that you would not be chayv halos chutz because inside the mikdash you could not bring this. This is not considered a viable korban, a valid korban, because it's already chaser b'fnim. But in a case where it was not chaser, it was sholim inside, and then it became chaser on the outside, that was the subject of the suffix of Ibailu, of the Gemara, as to whether or not chisaron dechutz shmei chisaron or lav shmei chisaron. Toshma. I'm sorry. Toshma, we want to bring a proof from the Mishnah. V'kulan shechasru v'kriv b'chutz potter. Now, again, we don't know exactly what the Mishnah is talking about. When the Mishnah says you're potter because it was chaser, is the Mishnah talking about a case where it became chaser on the inside? And that clearly says Rav, even according to the Chachamim, he'd be potter. Or perhaps, and that's what the Gemara assumes right now in the Toshma, that it's talking about a case where it became chaser in the chutz. And you're potter, so it means that even though the Rabbanan say that that the Rabbanan who say that for chaser b'fnim you're potter b'chutz would extend that to even a case where we came chaser b'chutz, even though it was shalom b'fnim. Lo, says the Gemara, that's not what this Mishnah is talking about. When the Mishnah says you're potter, it's because it was already chaser b'fnim. So it seems like the Gemara doesn't really come to any definite conclusion. The Mishnah says, "Amakriv kodshim." If a person brings the basar of kodshim bachutz, then he's chayiv halos chutz. Let's just go back for a minute to the Mishnah. Amakriv kodshim ve'murim bachutz chayiv. V'amai va'ika chatzitza. Oh, so what happened was that he's got the basar of the kodshim connected to the emurim, and he was makter them bachutz. And the Mishnah says he's chayev. Now the Gemara says, what about chatzitza? Because the akrava has to be on the emurim, not on the basar. And assuming, let's say, we don't know what's on top or what's on the bottom, that's going to be the sugya, but assuming that the basar is on the bottom and the emurim on the top, then the basar is chotzetz and separates the mizbeach from the emurim. And if that be the case, then so 1 minute. First, let's go back. If you remember, we discussed the machlokas tanoim between Rabbi Yosei Glili and Reb Shimon about halah bachutz, whether it has to be on a mizbeach or it could even be on an even or a cell. So now we're going according to Rabbi Yosei Glili. You're only chayv halas chutz only if you did that krava on a mizbeach. And the Gemara thinks that the halach of chatzitza that applies in avodas pnim would also apply to halas chutz. So when the Torah sets up the condition that you're only chayv halas chutz on a mizbeach, it means that there's nothing separating between the eish, the fire on the mizbeach, and the emurim. But here in this case, the basar is now separating the mizbeach from the emurim. And really, in truth, the Gemara should have asked this question even bifnim as far as whether or not the carbon is kosher. Rashi points out that the Gemara is going to discuss that in Masechta Menachos. Let me just see if he adds anything here. If the meat, meaning the basar, right, which is nechal, comes between the emurim and the eish on the mizbeach, then that's going to be a chatzitza that prevents the emurim from being considered on the eish on the mizbeach. Oh, here he points out the Gemara is assuming, like Rabbi Yossi that we had on Kuf Ches, that you're only chayav for chutz on a mizbeach. Oh, so here we have machlokas between three different amorim. Omar Shmuel Kishafachan. The case of the Mishnah for which you chayav bachutz is where the emurim are directly on the eish, and the basar is on top of the emurim, and therefore the basar is not a chatzitza. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, I don't have to go as far as Shmuel is concerned. Hamani Reb Shimoni to my helal sel chayav, which means that according to Reb Shimon, you chayav halos chutz even without a mizbeach. And if you don't need a mizbeach, you could do it on a rock or a stone. Then obviously there's no din of chatzitza. And Rav Omar min b'mino eino chotzetz, which means that the basar, the carbon, together with its emurim and chalavim, are considered min b'mino. They're considered like they're one entity, and therefore it's not a chatzitza. So, meaning Rav says that even if I assume that the basar is separating between the eish and the murim, it doesn't matter, because the basar itself is called min b'mino with the emurim. And this leads us to the Mishnah. And now we're going to learn about menachos. So in the case of a mincha, we need kmitza, and kmitza is going to be matir the shirayim. And the only time you chayv halos chutz is when there already was a carbon that was kosher inside the azara, and then you took it out of the migdash and burnt it on the mizbeach. But mincha shlo nikvitza, if the kmitza didn't happen yet, which means that the shirayim doesn't have a matir, so if the krivim bachutz, if he takes a mincha and he's makrivin on a mizbeach outside, potter. Why? Because again, on the inside, he didn't yet have the matir. And in general Zevachim, the same thing would apply if he was Mala B'chutz before the Zrikas Hadam. Next, Kmotza v'chaza kumtza l'socha. Let's say he did a kmitza b'chutz, and then he brings the komets back into the migdash. After he brings the komets into the migdash, he takes it out a second time. The kriv b'chutz, he was makriv it. But so we don't say that since at one point it was taken out, and therefore it became possible. No, as long as it went back in, he could be chayiv for halah b'chutz. Now, he points out in the footnote that you take off the komets from the mincha, and he burnt the komets together with the mincha, bachutz. Now, in the migdash, he should have been makriv, he should have been maktir only the komets and not the mincha as well. Because anything but the komets, which is called shirayim, is meant to be nechal yidei zichrei kuna. So let's say he went ahead bifnim, and he did what he shouldn't have done, and he burnt the shirayim together with the mincha. Although he shouldn't have done it, but after the fact, the mincha is ksher, and it's ol l'bayil b'shem chova. And therefore, if he does such a thing b'chutz, he's going to be chayav. Frek the Gemara v'amai. Now the Gemara introduces halacha bittul. The shirayim is much larger in volume than the komets, and therefore libatel shirayim lekomets. The shirayim should now be mevatel lekomets. And the Gemara right now is assuming that the laws of bittul apply even with regard to kodshim karbanos. Amar Abzera, Nemra haktorah b'komets v'nemra haktorah b'shirayim. In both cases, the Torah uses the word haktorah, and that's in one pasuk. It says kol ki kol sior v'chol dvash lo saktiru mimenu ishe Hashem. That's a pasuk in Vayikra Perik Beis. And that pasuk follows an earlier pasuk which mentions the komets. And the Torah also speaks of Haktorah with regard to the Mincha. So we have Haktorah in the Torah regard to the komets, Haktorah regard to the Mincha. What does this teach me? Ma Haktorah's komets, ein komets mevatel chavero. With regard to being mak to the komets, it would not be mevatel another komets, af Haktorah shirayim, ein shirayim mevatlim komets. So this is derived from the equation between shirayim and komets. So let's say you mix together a larger komets of one mincha together with the smaller komets of another mincha. And we're going to burn this tarovis, this mixture, on the mizbeach. and we're going to be yotze both menachos, the komets of this one and the komets of the other one. And that's based on a rule, which is very fundamental, that in karbanos, there's no din of bittul. And that's a sugya in Masechta Yoma with regard to dam hapar and dam hasoyer. Because the Torah says that the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur should mix the blood of the par with the blood of the soyer, then there's a lot more blood in the par than there is in the soyer. And we still say, the Torah calls it, when he does the Hazoya, he does Hazah with the dam of the par and the dam of the soyer, even though they're both mixed together. And we don't apply the principle of bittul to say that the dam of par is mevatel, the dam, the miut, which is the dam hasoyer. It's still considered dam hasoyer as a separate viable entity. So we derive from this that with regard to kodshim, there's no din that one kodshim is mevatel another. And then we have the Gzeres Shavak Torah, which teaches us that the shiraim of a mincha is treated like the mincha itself, meaning the komets itself, and there's no bittul of one to the other. Hence, we understand why the Mishnah says that mincha v'shalom nikmitz of ekriv b'chutz, etc., that he's chayav. And now we get to the next Mishnah. Hakometz v'alavona. There are two parts of the matir of menachos. One is called the kometz, and the other is called the lavona. And hikriv es echad mehem b'chutz. Let's say he was only makriv one of them. Now we said that according to Rabbi Lazar, you're only chayav behalah b'chutz if you mala the entire carbon. And here he was only mala one of the two, either the kometz or the levona. Is therefore the Mishnah continues, says Rabbi Lazar, poter ad sheyakvus hasheni, because Rabbi Lazar says that you're not chayav ad shemales kula. Echad bifnim v'echad b'chutz. What happens if he went ahead and he was makriv bifnim, only one of the two, either the kometz or the levon? He was meant to be makriv both of them. The other one, which he wasn't makriv b'chutz, he took outside and he was mala b'chutz. He should have been mala bifnim, and he's chayav. Okay, and it seems that even Rabbi Lazar in this case would concede that you're chayav, even though he wasn't mala the whole thing, because we consider as if he's completing the halah that he started on the inside, as if he was mala the entire thing on the outside. Now, we're going to shift our emphasis now from the menachos to the lechem aponim. And the lechem aponim, which was organized on the shulchan on two sides, vertically, on Shabbos, and you had to add shnei bezichin of levona. So bezichin of levona is a certain volume of, let's say, a spoonful of levona that was put on one section of the shulchan, that's the 6, and then another bazich on the other section, and hikrivis echad me'em b'chutz. Now, the lechem aponim are eaten the following Shabbos by the kohen, but only if the bazichin were burnt on the mizbeach. So the burning of the bezichin on the mizbeach are matir the lechem aponim to kohen. In this case, he was only makriv b'chutz, one of the two bezichin. So once again, we get back to the machlokes Chacham and Rabbi Lazar. Chacham say you're chayav for halas chutz even on part of the carbon. Rabbi Lazar poter ad sheyakvus hasheni, because he's only chayav for both of them, but echad bifnim v'ech b'chutz. If he was maktir one of the two bazichin inside the Mizbeach. I'm trying to remember which Mizbeach. I think it's a Mizbeach Apnimi, but don't quote me on that. And then he was makriv the other bazich of Lavona outside the Mikdash. Then even Rabbi Lazar would agree that in this case he's chayav. And why is that? Because, like we said before, with regard to the Shirayim and the Lavona of a mincha, that we sort of integrate that which he did bifnim. He didn't complete that, but he completed it bachutz. Then we integrate that which he did bifnim with that which he did bachutz, and he's chayiv even according to Rabbi Elazar. Boy, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha raised a suffix. Kometz mao sheyatir kinegdo shirayim. Let's say he had to be maktir an entire kometz, and that's matir the shirayim for the kohanim. But instead, he was maktir only part of the shirayim. And the Gemara wants to know, can we divide up the mamoshus, the be'en of the mincha, and set up a kind of a ratio between the kometz and the mincha, and say that whatever percentage of the kometz that he burnt on the mizbeach, a parallel percentage of the mincha would become mutter through the matir of the kometz. But let's just see if he adds anything here. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafshus Safek, one who burns upon the mizbeach, he's matir only part of the kometz of a mincha, or alternatively, he was maktir. Right, we said that there are two elements that combine in order to set up the matir of the shirayim in mincha. You need both kometz and lavona. Let's say he was maktir on the mizbeach only the lavona and not the kometz, or in the reverse case, he was maktir the kometz and not the lavona, and he needs both to set up the matir of the shirayim. Now he has the mincha, and he wants to separate the mincha into parts, and each part will parallel a different element in the matir, whether it's the kometz or the lavona, and whether or not that part of the mincha could receive and be impacted by the matir that parallels it, whether it be the kometz or the lavona. And now the Gemara analyzes the suffix. Mishra Shari o Klushe Miklash. In other words, in order to be matir the shirayim of the mincha, you need both the kometz and the lavona. Those are the two elements, the combination of which will be matir the shirayim. Do we say that once he was matir one of the two matirim, that's going to be poel, that's going to impact and be matir part of the mincha, so that the Kohanim could eat that part of the mincha? The remainder of the mincha remains prohibited until you bring the other matir, whether it's the kometz or lavona, doesn't matter. And that's called, in the Gemara's language, Mishra Shari. The other possibility, which is called Kalushay Miklash, is that when you are maktir one of the two matirim, so the Isur of Achilas Hashirayim becomes niklash, it becomes weakened. It's no longer the same. Maybe there'll be an afkamin in terms of the onish that you get, but there's no full-fledged matir to remove the Isur entirely on any part of the shirayim. Iboy leman diomar Rabbi Meir. I'll leave the man. I'll leave it to Rabbi Meir. So now we're going to get into machlok between the Chachamim and Rab Meir about whether this pigul and a chatzi matir. I aliva de Rabbi Meir the Yomi mefaglin b'chatzi matir. Let's say he had a machsheves chutz lizmano on part of the matir, and this is a Mishnah in Menachos. So, for example, we say that the matir of Shirayim in Mincha is the Kometz and the Levona. And he needs both matirim to be matir the Shirayim. He had a machsheves chutzes maro on one of these two matirim, either on the kometz or the lavona. Rabbi Meir says that the entire carbon becomes pigul because yesh pigul bechatzi matir. And the Chachamim rejected, and they hold ein mefaglin bechatzi matir, a machsheves chutz lizmano of pigul cannot impact unless his machshava was on the entire matir, meaning both elements of the matirim, which would mean in this case both the kometz and the levona. So the Gemara thinks that if you're raising this question, Rav Yitzchak Nafcha, according to Rabbi Meir, who holds mefaglim b'chatzi matir, is then mishri shari. Certainly, you could say that one of the two matirim, whether it be the kometz or the levona, could be matir some sort of corresponding part of the shirayim. Why? Because it seems that according to Rabbi Meir, each matir, although they work in tandem, can be viewed as a separate entity. For example, Rabbi Meir talks about creating pigul, and now it could be matir. It could work in a separate entity to be matir, part of the shirayim. But I don't get it. You want to know whether or not haktoras, one of the two matirim, meaning either the kometz or the levona, could be matir. It can't be matir anything, because according to the Rabbanan, the two matirim form one indivisible entity, and the proof is because Chacham hold ein mefag mechatzi matir. So Mimanav Shach Yosafik Rav Yitzchak Nafcha doesn't hold water. Ella says the Gemara, there's a third Tana. Aliba de Rabbi Lazar. Right, Rabbi Lazar holds that you're only chayiv halos chutz if you maktir the entire karma, which means that in the case of a karma mincha, you are maktir bachutz both the kometz and the levona. And now we get to the suffix of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Is it A or B? A. Rabbi Elazar Kirabonin Svirlin. Basically, Rabbi Elazar accepts the sheet of the Chachamim, the Ein Mefagli B'chatzi Matir. And if that be the case, then one of those two Matir could not in any way impact on the Shirayim, not even to weaken the level of the Iser of Achilus HaShirayim. So therefore, once again, what does Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha gain by invoking the Shita of Rabbi Lazar? Ela liva de Rabbanan lahacha. That the Rabbanan here say that you chayav halos chutz on either the kometz or the levona without the other one. Is my mishri shari or miklish kolish? What would be the din in a case where he was maktir one of the two, either the shirayim, either the komets or the levona inside the migdash kedasu kedin, but he's only maktir one of the two matirim. Shall we say it works independently as a matir on part of the shirayim? Or should we say no? It cannot be matir part of the shirayim, and it could only weaken the iser on that part of the shirayim. And the Gemara leaves it as an outstanding question. That leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Kuf Yudam and Aleph. Hazorek mixas domim bachutz. So we had the machlokes Rabbi Loz and the Chachamim as to whether or not in halos chutz you have to be male the entire carbon or only part of it. And now we're talking about miktas dam. So I think we're talking about a chatas hapnimis. Let me just make sure that I'm right. Oh, so we're talking now about a chatos hapnimis. With regard to a chatos chitzona, where one nesinas dam, one matan damim is sufficient, and he doesn't have to do it on all the four corners, then for sure he bichayv halos chutz on part of the dam, because you don't need the entire dam to be mater chatos hachitzona. But in the case of a chatas hapnimis, where you have to do hazos, and you need all the hazos together, and one hazos dam is not sufficient unless you complete the entire process, and the korban chatas hapnimis is going to be possible. Nevertheless, the Mishnah says in chutz, in Allah's chutz, you be chayev even for part of the dam. And the Gemara is going to have to try to understand why that's so.